Part 1, roles and responsibilities. So what is a trustee? Now, the other thing to say is that you might not all be trustees, that is members of charities, etc. Some of the broad principles that will be developed in this webinar apply to running any organisation, whether it be a charity or whether it just be an unincorporated association, a small group, etc. So generally speaking, trustees are people that serve on the governing body of a charitable organisation, the board, and obviously they're responsible for the general control, the management, administration, all sides, all bits of the organisation. There are different ways that trustees can be referred to, so they could be directors if it's a charitable company or a company limited by guarantee, etc. They could be board members, governors in terms of which depending on whichever setting, or many times they're just actually members of a management committee. One of the things that crops up a lot actually through POWIS, particularly in village hall settings, where village halls have been set up with a charitable object, then they tend to have lots of people who are sort of representative of organisations in the area of benefit of their charity, who are invited to send members to the committee of management. They think they're on a management committee, but they don't actually know they're trustees. So that's one of the things to watch out for, that, you know, even if you're just a management committee member, depending on how the organisation is structured, you could actually be a trustee as well. It's the role, generally speaking, not the title, that matters. So moving on. What do trustees do? Well, usually they serve as unpaid volunteers. So, you know, we're not talking about people who get paid for doing their service for their charity here. We're talking about expenses at the most in terms of any remuneration. So just covering the costs of actually being involved and serving on the charity. We are looking at people who make decisions collectively. So, you know, in terms of running the organisation, it's not one voice that's stronger than the other. It's not the chair, it's not the secretary, it's not the treasurer that has a particular amount of responsibility or a different voting rights, as it were. So we act as a trustee, we act collectively to run the organisation. And obviously we need to put the interests of the organisation before any other consideration when we're doing so. So for me, this is a very important one. I'm the person in PAVO who gets to read everybody's governing document. I seem to sort of do that for bedside reading these days. But it is around how do organisations, what do they set up to do, and understanding what they're set up to do. And really, first principles is the governing document, which will tell you your objects, what you're actually set up to do, how you're actually set up to do it, who you're actually doing it for, etc. We'll come back into more of those sort of a terminology of that when we get to section 2. And then D, obviously trustees are the ultimate responsibility. They have the ultimate responsibility for ensuring the organisation is both well run and it's compliant with the various laws, good practice, etc. that governs or regulates the charitable sector. So, okay. Who can be a trustee? So generally speaking, it's slightly different in terms of the new CIO that's being brought in, which is the charitably incorporated organisation. But generally speaking, to be a trustee, you need to be over 18 years of age, so your age of legal responsibility, as it were. CIOs, that can actually go down to 16, but it does depend upon there being others upon the board of a certain age that can sort of validate the decision making, etc. Most people are eligible, but some are disqualified by law. So, you know, there are obviously offences that you can actually commit that involving deception or dishonesty. I wonder why deception and dishonesty is in there. Surely that can't be right. So, yes, obviously you need to be a proper person, a proper and fit person to run a charity. Anyone that's already been disqualified from being a company director or a trustee, so, you know, you've got to keep your nose clean. Undischarged bankrupt. So bankrupt is obviously, you know, somebody who has come into an arrangement with their creditors, can't pay their way, etc. So I guess you're probably clear on those terminologies. One thing to be aware of now is that new guidelines on who and who can't be a trustee are coming into force almost, you know, at the end of the month. There's not a vast amount of change. The categories above are still valid, but what it's trying to do is it's trying to actually impose some of those qualifications onto a wider cross-section. So it's not just the charity trustees, it might actually be the managers of the charity as well. So the chief execs also come under the same disqualification criteria. There's other new reasons for disqualification as well, such as being in contempt of court. So, being a liar, etc., being named under particular anti-terrorism legislation, or being on the sex offenders list. But yeah, so generally speaking also, you cannot be a trustee if you are an employee of an organisation. The idea, going back to what was previously said about trustees are not people who are paid for performing a trustee role. Therefore, you cannot actually be an employee of an organisation because you're receiving benefit from that organisation, and therefore you're setting up a conflict of interest if you are a trustee and an employee. Okay. I feel like I'm racing on, so hopefully that's okay, and I'm not rushing too much. It is quite difficult to actually get any, I can't see the whites of your eyes, but there you go. Bear with me. So trustees' roles and responsibilities. Roles a trustee can have. So trustees may take on one or more different roles. So, especially if the organisation is small, you tend to wear lots of different hats in a charity. And so obviously the first role, the primary function of a trustee is the governance role. It's overseeing from on high almost the actual running of an organisation, and that's setting the targets, setting the objectives. The day-to-day stuff is much more a managerial function. Jumped ahead. Within that governance role, obviously there is specialisation. So you might have a treasurer who is specifically looking after the finances of the organisation. Different people could be sort of focusing in on different aspects of the organisation. So you could perform a specific board role, and that might even be things along the lines of sort of HR support to the organisation, doing appraisals, doing assessments, etc. And that could be both at board level or on a subcommittee, etc. Then there's a sort of a more day-to-day management role, and this is specifically, or not specifically, this tends to happen more in terms of small charities where there is no staff, or staff need more support, etc. And so your trustee is being pulled into much more of a management role on a day-to-day basis, and that's much more of an administrative role. And finally, there is also the volunteer role. So you might actually be, you might even start off as a volunteer within your charity, actually delivering a service or helping to deliver a service to the beneficiaries of the charity, and get then sucked into being a trustee as well. So you can perform many different roles. The key issue here, I guess, is to make sure that you know which role you're actually performing at which particular time, so that you can actually park your governance role when you're doing your volunteer role. It all feeds back into that governance role, but you just need to understand that you are sort of separating yourself out as you're performing a specific function. Okay, so this is the bit where I start to frighten you now. This is about statutory duties and responsibilities. So it's there are legal and ethical issues that we need to consider. So where do these statutory duties and responsibilities arise from? Well, they arise in relation to employing staff, occupying premises, providing services, etc. So entering into sort of contracts, legal contracts. If you are a registered charity or a company, then you've got various duties that you must do in terms of reporting, whether it be to the Companies House, Charity Commission, etc. If you're a trust, then you're either administering potentially money, potentially other things, property, etc., for a particular benefit. So you have a trust that you must perform. And these are all bound and tied by various contractual duties and responsibilities. So these generally arise, as we've said. So contractual duties and responsibilities are what the organisation's governing document tells you. So it's forming basically a contract between the organisation, its members, and its beneficiaries. It is a contract between you and the people that you're seeking to help in terms of how you go about delivering things. This is why I tend to bang on about governing documents quite a bit, because it's the basis from which all organisations are formed. It's quite eye-opening, and when I'm doing this training session in a live environment, when I have people around me, I've asked people before now to bring in their organisation's governing documents so that we could actually go through them and have a sort of a discussion around some of the various clauses within them. Interesting things have cropped up in the past. Organisations that have a number of trading outlets that have a bar to actually doing any permanent trading written into their constitution. Had one organisation that actually didn't know whether they'd sent their trustee with their current governing document or one that had been updated. So these things can get lost sight of quite easily. They can sit in a drawer somewhere. They can not be read. New trustees, did they receive copies of the governing document which help them to understand why they're there, or how they're there, or what the organisation's supposed to do? There are also, moving on to B here, there's also legally binding agreements with third parties. So if you enter into a lease, that's a legally binding contract. There are penalty clauses if you come out of that lease early. You're contracting with employees, you're creating legal situations, etc., whereby you are responsible as trustees to actually make sure that they are delivered as you said they would be delivered, or as you entered into a legal agreement to deliver them. And that's the same with goods and services. And we'll come on a bit later in terms of looking at incorporation and liability and things like that, which apply particularly to things like leases as well. Okay, so that was looking at statute. So that statute law is there's a whole body of laws passed by government, etc., that sit on the statute books and sort of require organisations to work in a certain way. Another area that you need to abide by is sort of common law duties and responsibilities. So these arise from decision of the court, so the case law that's built up over many, many years. Sort of an example of that is if an organisation is trying to form a new charity that is using purposes that have never been agreed before by the courts or by the Charity Commission, you're almost developing case law as you go and actually agreeing those purposes for the new charity. Obviously, for charities particularly, there's charity and trust law. So the Charities Act 2011, Trustees Act 2000 all set out the way that charities should operate. And within that as well, obviously, if it's set up in law, then there is sanction in law as well if you don't actually abide by the responsibilities that are laid out in these documents. And on top of that, there is the whole sort of reputational side. So not just the legal side, but the reputational side of being a trustee. And that is making sure that you abide by good practice, by the prevailing opinions in the sector. You may or may not have come across something called the Charity Governance Code, which has been agreed and developed both by the Charity Commission and other actors. So I think the Society of Chairs, the NCVA organisations in covering the whole of the voluntary sector across the UK have come together and agreed a new sort of best practice guidance called the Governance Code. And really that's about getting charities to sort of sign up to and agree to follow best practice and to constantly try and look at themselves and the way that they do things. So there is a sort of an onus upon trustees to do good practice, to do things better and better. And then there's the moral obligation side of things, whereby, after all, you are a charity, therefore you have been set up to do things for the benefit of others, and you tend to make promises in doing that. And just forming the organisation is a promise to your beneficiaries that you will act in a certain way. You might be making promises to people who are donating to your good cause. And it could well be that there's other principled beliefs which guide the organisation's actions depending on the reasons for which they were set up. That whole area looks primarily towards the reputation as well of the sector. A lot of the things that organisations such as regulators such as the Charity Commission look out for is the impact of bad practices upon the confidence that the public hold in the charity sector, and that's been rocked a lot recently by, Oxfam scandals, Save the Children scandals, etc. Charities have to be seen to be whiter and white just to encourage people to still invest their trust in them, and obviously be prepared to actually donate to the sector. So you can't do anything without that sort of trust that is built by good practice and by sticking to your moral obligations. I'm just going to take a very quick drink as I'm drying up, and then we'll move on to something a bit meaty, which is liability of trustees. Sorry if that sounded loud in your ears. Okay, so personal liability. What are we talking about? So if trustees act improperly, they may be personally responsible for the liabilities incurred by the charity, or they might be responsible for making good any losses to the charity. Generally speaking, when we're talking about improper conduct, it's very rarely that it's willful or something that somebody has set out to do, or charities have set out to do. It's things that have happened because they've come adrift from their governing document. They don't understand what powers they have in terms of running their charity, and they go and do something that is ultra vires, beyond powers, etc. Ignorance is no defense in law, needless to say. So you just have to be very, very sure that when you're acting, and the reasons that you're acting are in the best interest of the charity, but also fit to your charity's governing document. Trustees, again, just restating the point, as trustees act collectively in running a charity, they are usually collectively responsible to meet any such liability. It was an interesting case, actually, just to get into the financial side of things. I believe it was a golf course. A golf course had entered into a contract with a builder for certain repairs. They thought it was a fixed price contract that they'd entered into, and they'd agreed an amount that the repairs were going to run to. The builder had other ideas, and there was about £20,000 discrepancy over and above the cost that the charity was going to pay. And the builder basically sued each and every member of the trustee body. He wasn't suing them for any particular amount. They were suing them for the recovery of the whole amount. Each member of the trustee body was being sued for the missing 20,000. As soon as the first case was won, and it was actually against the chair of the charity, so he got his 20 grand, the builder, from the personal assets of the chair, then it gets to the stage of, well, the chair is only one member of that actual organisation, and the chair then almost has to go and sue the other members of the trust body to recover an equal share from each of them, because they were all responsible for the decision. So that's frightened you, probably. So how do you actually limit this? Well, obviously, it's to sharpen your mind. It's to make sure you understand what you can actually be liable for, and that you make those decisions collectively, that you are actually paying attention and not allowing a strong person on the board to make those decisions without having them properly discussed. Okay, so what can you be liable for? So breach of trust or duty. So that is where you have basically gone beyond what you've been set up to do. You're acting outside the powers of the governing document, or, clearly the most obvious one, you're carrying out fraudulent or wrongful trading. You're sharp practicing, as it were. Carrying out unpermitted political activity. Charities have to be very neutral and have to be very careful in terms of how they're perceived as well, let alone what political activity they might be doing. There's been a lot of pressure on charities presently, actually, in terms of where they are being perceived to stray into political activity, and it's a bit of a minefield, as you can imagine, because the way politicians tend to be, and the sensitivity to criticism. So even if you're campaigning for something that is very much a social wrong, then you could be straying into political territory. So how do you actually make sure you're actually perceived being sort of very apolitical in terms of what you're doing? Obviously, receiving personal benefit as a trustee. So we'll come on to that here in terms of conflict of interest as well, because to a certain extent, that's what conflict of interest is all around. Obviously, acting as a trustee director when disqualified, and failure to comply with statutory requirements. So that is, mea culpa. I'll put my hand up on this one. I have been, not to a charity, but I've been secretary to a company limited by guarantee, working in the voluntary sector, it's a local development organisation, and I managed to forget to send in a confirmation statement for that company. So I've done the same with the accounts. I didn't forget to send the accounts in on time. I managed to send the accounts in minus the signed page, which I'd left on the photocopier. And the company's house is, shall we say, not very understanding of these matters, and promptly issued a £600 fine, which, you know, ouch. So, you know, there are things that hit you if you're not careful, if you don't pay sufficient attention. And going back to my confirmation statement, I am not a trustee of that. I was rather not a director of that organisation. I was just a volunteer. I was actually doing stuff as a sort of a volunteer secretary for the organisation. And I managed to forget that the confirmation statement was due in March. I got into my head that it was due in May, and I hadn't checked my emails to receive on the particular account that the company receives emails. So I'd missed the reminders. And the first I knew about it was when registered letters started arriving for all the trustees, or all the directors rather, at the registered address of the company, which went down well, as you can imagine. But that's what we're talking about. You've got to actually comply with your statutory requirements, or else, basically. You know, there was lots of threats from Companies House within those registered letters that went out, in terms of the potential fines to the directors, etc., you know, exclusion from being directors, etc. And if you've got people who are directors of other companies, etc., it can be quite a shock. Lots of etceteras in that statement. I shall try and give up on those. Okay, so moving on, reducing the risk of personal liability. Right, what is it unlikely you will be held personally liable for? So, or rather, you will be, I'll start again. It is unlikely you will be held as personally liable if you, I've lost it, there we go, act reasonably, properly as a trustee. So the key issue here is that you've got to be seen to be acting properly. You've got to have minuted meetings, etc. You've got to be showing a process. If you can show that your process is fully considering the issues, is actually referring to your government document, is taking legal advice if you need to, then you are acting reasonably and properly as a trustee. Things can still go wrong, but if they do, under those instances, you're unlikely to be seen as being liable. Yeah. You need to comply with your organisation's governing document. These are points that I've already sort of covered. I'll give you an example of this, naming no names, but a community centre in Paris was set up with just straight village hall trusts. Basically, it was there to run a village hall that was attached to a school. At some point along the lines, somebody got into their head that it would be good to also take on a lease for the recreation ground that sat next to the community centre. And then to improve the recreation facilities, they thought, well, let's buy that adjacent piece of land and sort of put all-weather pitches on there, put various bits of infrastructure on there. And they entered into various contracts to provide that infrastructure, and those contracts ended with them having about £20,000 worth of debt that they were paying off over sort of on a repayment schedule with one of the organisations that actually assisted them to put this infrastructure in place. Only, of course, that they were a village hall trust and they'd had no powers to do any recreation activities, and basically that debt was the responsibility of the trustees who acted beyond those powers. So, shall we say, there was a bit of a mess. We had to advise the trustees of the village hall that were currently operating that if they actually continued to service that debt, they would be acting beyond the powers of the organisation as well and would be personally liable. So you can get yourself into all sorts of difficulties if you start to stray away from what you've been set up to do. Finally, take appropriate professional advice when you don't know enough to make a decision. Never be too proud to actually ask proper advice. Hopefully, if you're a charity, you can get that advice pro bono or in ways that do not cost the charity huge amounts of money. But to a certain extent, if the decision is that vital that you need to spend a bit of resource to make sure that you're acting legally and professionally, then it's well worth doing that, because otherwise, you could be picking up the mess many years hence. Okay. So reducing the risk collectively. Again, just emphasizing the fact that trustees are all created equal and should operate equally. They should take decisions in collectively, etc. So the collective responsibility that you have, therefore, is to make sure your charity has good management practices, has clear roles and responsibilities. If you're doing more than just an overview governance role, if you're actually doing working with staff, working with your beneficiaries, etc., make sure that the roles and responsibilities of who's designated to do what are clear. Ensure that there's accurate record keeping. That's not just financial records, that's also minuting of decisions. Keep a good and comprehensive record so you can see what's been decided, how it's been decided. We'll come on to that again also in terms of the conflict of interest side of things. Make sure you have a bit of slack, a bit of contingency funds that you've planned for things that might happen, things that might not come off. Easier said than done, perhaps, but you need to try and build that into what your thought process is in terms of taking your charity forward. Always seek professional advice. That could be, to a certain extent, even if it's sort of entry level advice, such as perhaps Pavo can give, in terms of we've got plenty of built up information and experience and case history, I guess, that could be useful to any charity before you actually go down the route of a legal advisor. And I would state as well, in terms of any legal advice that you take on, bear in mind not every lawyer is a charity expert, etc. There are, there's law and there's law. Board development. This goes back to that charity code. It goes back to sort of always making sure that when people come on board as trustees, they're given the opportunity to come on training such as this, or the expanded version that we do, that they're actually given a copy of the governing document, that they're actually sort of mentored even within the role to start with by a member of the board. You can also take out liability insurance as well. So that's obviously, you've heard of your public liability, but there's also a professional liability insurance that you can take out. A word of caution there, of course, is that, you can insure for certain things, but you can't insure for, coming away from your governing document. If you are acting irresponsibly as a trustee board, then no insurance in the world is going to cover you. Governing documents, I've already mentioned, and governing documents have some nice terms in them. First and foremost of which, purpose, or indeed trust. So what do we actually mean from a charity or an organisational point of view? So to be a charity, an organisation must have purposes, and they're defined pretty broadly as aims. This is what you're set up to do. But in terms of a charity, then they obviously need to be set up to do something which is exclusively charitable. A charitable trust, generally speaking, is a way for trustees, a group of people, to manage money, investments, land or buildings, and it sort of is defined by what they have to manage. Charities generally are broader than just having land or assets to manage. They are about assisting people in certain ways, campaigning for this, campaigning for that. So they have broader activities than perhaps just a trust. But to be valid, charities must be able to demonstrate both a clear charitable purpose and the delivery of benefit to the public, or some section of the public. And then there's some, how do you define that? It's not basically simply for a group of private individuals that a charity is acting. It must be able to demonstrate that it's broader than the people who set it up. So there are, how many charitable purposes are there? There's roughly 13 headings of charitable purposes that have been agreed, and under that sit a number of sort of descriptions of how you actually fulfill a particular charitable purposes. So some of these, I've got two up on the screen there. The advancement of amateur sport, is a charitable purpose. It's there, it's been defined in law, it's understood. You can set up a charity to advance amateur sport. And that means the advancement of any sport or games which promote health by involving physical or mental skill, exertion. So these are the types of things that when you're writing a charitable purpose, if you go on the Charity Commission's website, you will find a whole page of these 13 purposes, and underneath that it will break down into the types of things they mean by the advancement of amateur sport. And again, going back to case law, these are things that have already been agreed. The 13th, or the catch-all of charitable purposes, is the one that's on the screen there, which is any other charitable purposes, which it sounds wonderful. You can do everything, do anything and anything. So any charitable purpose that's not really been more clearly defined by the Charity Commission to date. So any new ones that come along, it's that catch-all. And it could be anything from the provision of facilities for recreation and other leisure time occupation. This is how the wording of charitable purposes goes. It's in the interests of social welfare, the object of improving the conditions of life, etc., etc. So if you take a look at your governing document, find out how, under what you sit in terms of where your charitable purposes are. If your charity was set up before the last Charities Act in 2011, it probably won't be written in the same way as you would do it now. So a charity written 20 years ago would probably have simpler purposes or simpler objects. We'll come on to objects. But these are the main headings. There's 13 of these charitable purposes, of which the advancement of amateur sport is one, and any other charitable purposes is the catch-all, under which all of the activities that you would likely to be do as a charity will be sort of categorized. So I mentioned objects previously. A charity's objects are, to a certain extent, their purposes. They are clearly linked with purposes, but they are written in a certain way that should make clear, A, what outcomes your charity is being set up to achieve. It's to advance, or it's to promote. The advancement of, the promotion of. You've got to be doing something that does something that has an end result. And then it has to explain in your objects how you will set about achieving those outcomes. It could be by providing advice, by raising awareness, by delivering Meals on Wheels, by it could be broken down into specific actions, or it could be much more broader terminology. The object should also state who will benefit from the outcomes, from the delivery of the charitable purposes, and how far those benefits extend to. So that could be a geographical area, that could be a certain section of the community, etc. But you clearly have to define it, and you have to put those into your governing document so that, again, it regulates how you actually run the organisation in the future. A charity's purposes and its objects should be the same. There should be no tension between the purpose, the charitable purpose as understood by the Charity Commission, and how you are actually going to set out to deliver that charitable purpose. And the object should express all of the charity's purposes. So you need to, you can be, in writing a governing document or in looking at your governing document, you could potentially see that there are more purposes being met than just one. Okay. What do we mean by public benefit? So for an organisation to be a charity, its purposes must fulfil the public benefit requirement. So it must be beneficial in a way that is easily identifiable, and not just identifiable, but actually capable of being proved. And, the more evidence you can actually get of that, the better, because it's not subjective. It's not down to a personal viewpoint. You, with your in your reporting to the Charity Commission, are supposed to, through your annual report, supposed to state how you've actually fulfilled your charitable purposes, and what evidence are you actually using to justify the statements that you put into your annual report? How are you actually collecting evidence that you're actually delivering your charitable purposes to the people that you're setting out to deliver it to? You have to bear in mind that any detriment or harm that results from the delivery of a charitable purpose, to people, property, or the environment, it needs to be balanced. And again, this is partly reputational as well. You must sort of weigh in the balance how the delivery of services to one section of the community does not actually impinge upon any other section of the community or the environment, etc. So purpose must benefit the public in general, or a sufficient section of the public. I mean, what a sufficient section of the public is, varies from purpose to purpose. It varies from how you set yourself up and what goals and what objectives you set. But it does have to be identifiable, and it has to be rational. So, I can't. I'm sort of in terms of one of my hobby horses. I've always wanted to actually set up a charity for the advancement of Napoleonic studies, but I guess it's only me and my mate Reg next door that might be interested in that one. So, it has to be thought through. It has to actually involve quite a few people out there in the community. And it's not to give rise to more than incidental personal benefit. So this goes back to, the requirement for trustees not to benefit financially from being a trustee. And we'll come on to this again in terms of conflict of interest in a moment. So personal benefit, is incidental. So, if you're a part of a charity that delivers a service, and you as a charity trustee are actually receiving support from that service as well, that's fine, as long as you're not receiving any other type of support that other members of the community are not receiving. So, it has to be proportionate. You cannot benefit personally where another member of the community would not. It's a byproduct. It's something that the carrying out of the purpose. It's a benefit that carrying out the service does across the whole of the community, etc. So I've mentioned powers previously and given you examples where organisations have acted beyond their powers. The Charities Act 2000 makes an assumption really now. So if you were setting up a constitution today, it's pretty much assumed that anything which is calculated to further its purpose, the purpose of an organisation, or is conducive or incidental to doing so, is allowed. It's pretty much telling you that you've got carte blanche to do anything that is in the interest of the charity. Governing documents define the powers by which objects can be promoted. So, as I say, modern constitutions generally give their powers the widest possible sort of leeway. You don't actually have to use the powers that are in your governing document, but if they're in there, you do have to obey them. You do have to abide by them. So they're discretionary in as much as you can choose not to use them, but they're not discretionary in that you can go beyond them and do things that your powers don't allow you to do. You can obviously delegate your powers to subcommittees. You can bring other people on to the organisation, onto a subcommittee of the organisation, but you have to be careful in terms of what your governing document says in terms of delegating those powers. So you, generally in terms of a subcommittee, I'm thinking of a live example, there's a subcommittee of an organisation in Powys that has a requirement for there to be 3 members of the board of directors on each subcommittee. Shame there's only 1 really, but never mind. Again, it's a bit of slippage in terms of the way they run their organisation, and they're making steps to address that now. So your governing document will also allow you to sort of understand what you can actually delegate or can't delegate to others who could potentially assist with the running of the charity. So, as I say, there's pretty much on new governing documents carte blanche, but if you look at yours, there'll probably be a list of powers of things that you can do, such as lending and borrowing, employing staff, insuring. We mentioned professional indemnity insurance, etc., or public liability insurance, just being able to run the business, acquiring and occupying property, so taking out a lease, buying the freehold, trading. I've mentioned some charitable constitutions have this bar on trading, full stop actually, and one of the, or certainly permanent trading activity. And one of the reasons for that is primarily to stop trading from skewing the actual objectivity of the charity, because once you get involved in trading, it can become all-consuming. You can actually put more effort into generating income through your trading arm than you can actually running the service you were set up to do. Just as an aside, if anybody is part of a charity that has a not so much a trading arm, but has a charity shop, it's worth bearing in mind that charity shops are not actually classed as trading by the Charity Commission or by charity law. There's a bit of a grey area there, in as much as if it's a question of charity receiving donated goods and then selling them on, that's not classed as trading. If the charity is actually, anything like postcards, buying something into their charity shop and then selling them on, that's trading. So you just have to be careful in terms of understanding what trading is in that respect. That's an aside. So setting up related companies and charities, so that's like, getting over this issue in terms of trading by setting up a trading arm, or setting up a new delivery arm to deliver an aspect of the charity, etc. You can alter constitutions, they're not set in stone. There are processes written into governing documents that say how you go about changing them. One thing to bear in mind is that you can't change your objects or your purposes without consultation with the Charity Commission. You can change pretty much anything else by holding an AGM or even by written resolution these days, but you just need to be careful that if you're changing objects, you get prior permission from the Commission. And then obviously powers to wind up the charity, what happens to the charity's assets, etc. So these are things that generally sit in governing documents. Right, trustee board. So trustees have overall control of the charity. We've mentioned that they might be known by other names: directors, board members, governors, committee members. But again, just re-emphasising the point, whatever they're called, trustees are the people who lead the charity and decide how it is run. So trustees using their skills and experience collectively, that's collectiveness basically is where this whole notion of a board comes from. It's a term borrowed from business, obviously, board of directors, etc. But what we're trying to get at here is that, it's not individuals that run charities. It is a collective effort of people coming together, discussing the needs, the issues, etc. of a charity, and all members being involved in the decision-making process. Very importantly as well, all members should have access to the same information upon which a decision is based. And to be quite frank, if the information isn't good enough, if you don't feel you can make a decision on that information, then you should say so, and that should be part of the whole board process, is making sure that you've got sufficient information to actually make decisions on. So what is the trustee board responsible for? Well, obviously it's making sure that the trust of the charity is carrying out the purposes for which it was set up. I'm banging on about the same old things here. That governing document tells you what you're set up to do, how you're supposed to go about it, and anything else that comes in, any other temptation, any other bit of cash that you wish to go and get, which, we all have a tendency in the third sector to chase funding, to wish to bend our objectives almost to try and fit into funding streams. Well, you just have to be very, very careful how you go about this, because it can skew your charitable purposes, your objectives, etc. So from going back to the role and responsibilities of a trustee, one of your responsibilities is to ensure that you understand the charity's purposes as set out in your governing document, that you plan what your charity will do, that you have a clear understanding of the direction of travel and what you wanted to achieve, that you explain as well, and this goes back to the confidence issue, that you explain to the public at large how the charity's activities are intended to further or support its purposes. People need to know why you're there, what you're doing, how you're trying to do it. Otherwise, why are they going to actually give you any of their time, their donation, or whatever? Understand how the charity benefits the public by carrying out its purposes. We can all be a little bit blinkered in terms of what we mean by the benefit, and unless you ask the beneficiaries, to a certain extent, how are you going to know that you're actually reaching them, you're actually being of benefit to them? bear in mind that spending charity funds on the wrong purposes is a serious matter. So in some cases, trustees may have to reimburse the charity personally. That's your liability issue. I haven't got any slides in here regarding how you could potentially limit some of that liability, which is a PowerPoint for another day perhaps, which is around obviously incorporation not being okay. Let's very quickly mention incorporation. Incorporation is where a charity takes on a legal entity of itself. So if you're unincorporated, all of the trustees, say let's talk about owning a building, owning land. Each trustee on an organisation needs to be registered as the owner of that land with the land registry, or you could have holding trustees, admittedly, but generally speaking, similarly, if you're taking out a lease on a building, then the lease rests with the individual charity trustees, not with the charity itself. Even though it's taken out for the purposes of the charity, in law, there is no legal entity in an unincorporated association that can take out that lease. So a way of limiting your liability is to incorporate, to create a legal entity. And that is, incorporation is simply setting up a company limited by guarantee, or you can now also set up a community charitably incorporated organization, a CIO, or of course there is the community interest company vehicle. So there are incorporated vehicles out there which do protect you to a certain extent in terms of making it easier to operate. But I would stress that you still have to you can't get away from the responsibilities that we've been outlining in the presentation to date. You are responsible for your actions and for the actions of your fellow trustees. Conflicts of interest. So what is a conflict of interest? Well, it's any situation where a trustee's personal interests or the interest that they owe to another body may influence their decision making. So the rule is, as we said, that trustees should not receive benefit from their charity, unless there is explicit authority from the Charity Commission gained beforehand. And this relates both to indirect and direct benefits. And again, it's based upon the principle, the first principle, that trustees should not be in a position where personal interests and their duty to the charity conflict. So where there is a potential for conflict, then that has to be managed. There is always going to be conflicts of interest. It's just fact of life to a certain extent. It's inevitable. And so really what this boils down to, this whole section is how do we actually manage them when they crop up? So conflict of interest usually arise where either there is a potential financial or a measurable benefit, something beyond the norm that benefits directly a board member, or indirectly through a connected person. So this is the classic example of a conflict of interest. There is another type of conflict of interest, and that is where a board member's duty to the organisation may compete with a duty or loyalty they owe to another organisation or person, and that's a conflict of loyalty. So basically what we're saying there is, I'm just trying to remember what I actually say. Let's keep going actually, and I'll cover that if I need to. So benefits to board members, what do we mean? Board members can only benefit from their organisation where there is an explicit authority in place before any decision conferring a benefit is made. Now, we've said that trustees cannot be employees. They can actually take on a management role, but they can't specifically be an employee of the charity, and they can't be paid for taking on that management role. In some instances where there is professional services that could be given to a charity, then there is an assumption that the trustee is the best person to actually give those professional services, and this can be sanctioned. And generally speaking, it needs to be sanctioned either by, it needs to be stated in the governing document, and I've seen some governing documents, particularly around things like accountancy, where an accountant is a governor, is a trustee, or perhaps even the treasurer. There is the ability, because they're providing a professional services, they can actually be remunerated for the professional service aspect of their role. There was another query that came into us, much more mundane, and that was a professional service, but it was a professional service from a plumber. Basically, there was a water leak in a charity's premises. One of the trustees fixed it, and in fixing it, they spent about 4 or 5 hours of their time plugging the leak, and doing that type of stuff. And there was this question that came into Pavo. We went, well, can we pay him for it? It saved us money. It was an emergency. If we'd have had to wait for X amount of time for to call out the emergency plumber, then we'd have been in stock, etc. So, where do you draw the line? Now, generally speaking, as I say, governing document is a good place to start. You're not going to be in the situation I've just discussed in terms of the plumber. You're not going to be going to the charity commission before you can employ your trustee plumber, because, to be quite frank, you might have to wait 12 weeks, and that's quite a lot of water out of your pipes, shall we say. So, a pragmatic approach to some of this, but the basic principle is that you're not going to be employing a trustee to deliver services to the charity without understanding what the market is around you as well. How do you actually go about making the decision to employ your trustee rather than another accountant? What sort of process do you put in place to make sure that you're not conferring a benefit, that there are others that you could potentially contract to perform a service rather than your trustee, etc. So we'll come on to that again a little bit more. Examples of potential benefits is where boards decide to sell, loan, lease an organisation's assets to a board member. You're in a privileged position. You've got insider information in terms of what assets are available, etc. Acquire, borrow, or lease assets from a board member for the organisation. So you're paying rent to one of your board members, etc. It is doable, but there's a decision-making process and a process that has to be managed. Pay a board member for carrying out their board member role. You certainly can't do that. Pay a board member for carrying out separate paid posts within the organisation, even if that board member has recently resigned as a board member. So there again, these are sort of the areas where you have to be careful, because you'd be looking like you'd be providing a benefit to somebody who has been either on the trustee board or is still remaining on the trustee board. I'll leave you go through. I won't read that out slavishly, so you'll be getting the idea. There's things on there in terms of employer, board member's spouse, or other close relative at the organisation. These are all potential areas where you'll be conferring a benefit. And again, it doesn't necessarily rule it out, but you just have to manage how you actually approach these situations. We mentioned earlier, the final one there, allow a service user board member to influence service provision to their exclusive advantage. It's where it's exclusive that there is an issue. It's where you're receiving a benefit that others who are helped by the charity don't receive. Looking at conflicts of loyalty. So these are arising because, although the affected board member does not necessarily stand to gain anything directly, there are consequences to the board member's decision making that could influence their choice in terms of what they do. So, for example, a board member's loyalty to the organisation could conflict with their loyalty to, perhaps they might be a trustee on another organisation. You might be competing for the delivery of services. It's unlikely that you'd be a trustee of two similar charities, but it could happen. The membership or section of organisation that appointed them to a board member. So this is I mentioned right at the start about committees of management, whereby representatives, people are asked to. Organisations are asked. Organisations in an area of benefit. Again, this was, if you remember, was the community centre example. So you have a community centre, and to make sure that it's the views on that, the management committee of the community centre are representative. All the organisations that might use the centre get to nominate a trustee to the management committee of the community centre. That management committee is a board. They are all trustees, but there is a mental block a lot of the time with the organisation that sends the person to the community centre charity and with the person who comes themselves, that they actually are a representative. They are there to do the bidding of the organisation that sent them, and that's not the case. They are there to basically represent the interests of the charity and the management of the community centre. But what they can do is they can bring a perspective that is wider, all right, from the area of benefit. So, but they are not there to represent the interest. So if it's a community centre and let's think there's an indoor bowls club, they are not there to do the bidding of the indoor bowls club on the management committee of the charity. So that's a conflict of loyalty. So yeah, we all have other lives. We all have sort of, day jobs, etc. If we're a trustee of an organisation, and probably I might be a good example of this actually. Yeah, so I'm a director certainly of a community interest company, but I'm also an employee of Pavo. So there's the potential for a conflict in terms of actually having to go and pass on messages to that organisation, etc. Can I represent the two at the same time? Or another, yes, so you might be a board member of two different organisations. Obviously, there's the family connection. Don't know how well you get on with your family. It could be an interesting dynamic, but you need to be careful about how decisions that you make can affect family members, etc. Okay, so I think hopefully conflicts of interest on conflicts of loyalty is self-explanatory. So where are we going with this? So the test, what does it look like? Is that, there is a conflict of interest test. So, and to a certain extent, it is whether, the test is that there is a conflict of interest if the board members, so the other board members, not just you, the other board members' interest could be seen to interfere with the board members' ability to decide the issue only in the best interest of the organisation. So are you making that decision? And are you being seen to make that decision based upon its merits, or are you being influenced by an outside influence, whether that be an influence that gives you a personal benefit or whether that gives you, a conflict of loyalty elsewhere? Now, there's a legal requirement in this, and that is that directors or trustees of organisations and companies must have authority in their governing document to allow unconflicted directors to decide that board members affected by the conflict can participate. So, what happens if you've got a situation where you've got a conflict of interest? How do you actually decide whether the scale, the nature of that conflict of interest? Do you allow the person who's conflicted to sit in on the decision making, possibly even have a vote? Do they leave the room? And to a certain extent, you have the ability to come up with your own policy on this. It's always wise for organisations to have conflicts of interest policy that state that where a conflict arises, well, actually, how to identify a conflict in the first instance. And there are things like a register of potential interests. So each director, each trustee lists the organisations that they are involved with. And that list basically is available at each meeting so that or other board members know where you potentially would have a conflict of interest. Obviously, then if an item comes up on the agenda where there is a potential conflict of interest, that director / trustee should be in a position to declare their interest. The board then has a policy which then decides, well, okay, so is that director able to contribute to the discussion around what the decision should be? It might be that director is actually very well informed about a particular subject because they are conflicted, and that they can actually provide advice, or they can provide at least participate in the discussion of the board, but then have to leave when the decision is taken. Or you could just make it simple. If you're conflicted in any way, shape or form, out you go. Well, make a decision without any potential for a perception that that we're paying too much attention to the reasons why you're conflicted, etc. So basically, the bottom line, even where you have that policy in place, even where you've got a clear process, you should ensure that you can demonstrate that any decision that's been taken is being taken in the best interest of the organisation. That is the bottom line. All of what we've been discussing in terms of roles and responsibility is that you're not acting in your own interest. You are acting collectively in the best interest of the organisation.